The 2025 edition of the ASUS ROG XG Mobile is quite possibly the most easiest turnkey eGPU solution out there. It has even more going for it, but let me show you how easy it is to actually work on a handheld or any other Thunderbolt device there is. In this instance, I am connecting it to an Xbox Ally X using the included Thunderbolt 5 cable, and as soon as I connect that Thunderbolt 5 cable to the Xbox Ally X, you can see the LED illuminate on the eGPU, indicating that it is on and ready to actually start working. Thank you to ASUS for sending out both of those units for me to test and actually complete this review. As you can see, I don't have it right now because I unfortunately had to send it back to ASUS. It was only for a limited time that I could have it, but I managed to capture all of the data that I needed to capture for a lot of different scenarios. We're going to go through all of those in a brief moment. What I love most about the 2025 edition of the XG Mobile is that it straddles the capability of being a completely portable GPU boost you can take with you while also being the most complete docking solution you can have. And the entire package includes a 330-watt power supply, all of that being under 1 kilogram or about 2 pounds. So if you wanted something that had the capability of offering you all of this power that you can then run on the handheld directly itself, you can do that. You can also just use it as a docking solution to then export to an external monitor to go for even better visuals and better performance. So you have those options available to you, and either one of those, you may only have one particular use case that you are actually interested in, and we'll cover those so you have a better idea of what you're going to get out of that. And then we'll also show you the opposite of that, going between handheld or docked and everything in between. Let's quickly talk about the specs that are on this device. Now, the main port is a Thunderbolt 5 PD3.1 compliant port that can go up to 140 watts of power to the host computer. So that's the main cable that you saw connecting back to whatever device you have. In this instance, that was the Xbox Ally X. But we get full fat bandwidth even to Thunderbolt 4 devices like the Xbox Ally X or even like a GPU Win Mini. So any Thunderbolt 4 or any Thunderbolt 3 device will work on this, even though the eGPU is indeed Thunderbolt 5, meaning it is PCIe 5, Thunderbolt 5 compliant. But it will work on those other versions. And what's really nice is we get full fat 3.6 gigabytes a second of throughput through that Thunderbolt 5 cable on a Thunderbolt 4 port. That's super huge, and I'll touch more on that in a second. I just want to finish up the rest of what's awesome about the specs on this device is we get on the network interface card, the NIC itself, it is a 5 gigabit capable port. So for LAN speeds, it can go up to 5 gigabit, meaning that if in your house you have a 5 gigabit switch or what you connect to is a 5 gigabit switch, it will go up to that speed. Now, for my house, the only thing that I've upgraded to throughout my entire house was 2.5 gigabit. So that's all I am able to achieve on this dock itself. But to further get back to what the specs on there, we do have an additional Thunderbolt 5 PD 3.0 compliant port that can give up to 27 watts of power, meaning this can offer an additional Thunderbolt 5 extension set of ports that you can also have on top of that if you really wanted, or just use that USB-C cable itself. We have two USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A ports, so if you just wanted to quickly insert any USB-A key or USB type of device on a more standard type of port, you have two of those that are completely the max spec that you can possibly expect. We have one HDMI 2.1 port that is FRL, or fixed rate link. That means that you get the full 48 gigabit per second uncompressed stream data from that HDMI 2.1 port. So it is full fat HDMI 2.1. You also have a DisplayPort 2.1 port and a UHS 2 SD card reader. And again, we have that built-in 330-watt power supply. Now, there are two different versions of the eGPU. All of those specs are standard between both of them. The main differentiator is the type of GPU that is on the dock itself. That is either the Nvidia 57 Ti version or the bigger brother 5090 version. Now, the price on those are vastly different. The 5070 Ti dock version comes in at $1,300, where the price on the 5090 version is around $2,500 on MSRP. So it's almost double in price. Is it double, almost double in performance? We'll get to that in a moment and really where we're going to start straddling this, but we have to kind of understand what we're getting into. Now, all of my testing was on the Xbox Ally X, which is a Thunderbolt 4 device, but the ASUS eGPU can work on any Thunderbolt capable device. Here you can see I'm connected to a Win 4, and what's nice, when you connect to a non-ASUS device, it immediately offers the user to download Armory Crate just for the eGPU alone to help with the installing drivers or firmware for the eGPU. Again, this is the most easiest and complete end-to-end solution, regardless if you're using an ASUS computer or not. So again, if you were the type of person that wanted a solution that you did not have to think at all and you wanted some company to literally hold your hand through the entire process, it looks like on the 2025 edition of the XG Mobile, ASUS really has pulled out all the bells and whistles and the red carpet is out. It has been the easiest way for me to just get on regardless of device I was using. And if you remember, I had mentioned earlier when we were talking about specs, we have that FullFat Thunderbolt 4 bandwidth. We have 3.6 gigabytes a second, and that is on the GPU Win 4 and the ASUS Ally X. Really didn't matter. We're going to get that full bandwidth. And why does that matter? Well, because in previous Thunderbolt 4 solutions, eGPU solutions, we get around 2.6 gigabytes a second. And when we had that, we'd had some particular issues, especially with any games that had ray tracing or putting those on, where we get weird instances of frame pacing and things would be all kinds of mucky, and we'd have to use Nvidia's profile inspector tool to either enable rebar or disable rebar to just try to fix the solution. And what's great is with this eGPU, you don't have to do anything. Like, it just works as it should, as best as it can. Now, I'm only testing on Thunderbolt 4 devices. I don't have a Thunderbolt 5 device to even test on. So this is even future-proofed a little bit further down the road than that with what is capable currently today. So this does offer some future-proofing insofar as Thunderbolt connectivity and being able to get additional bandwidth as the next generation of Thunderbolt capable devices start coming out. So there is that as well. This review will show data on different use cases for the eGPU, where some people might want to exclusively use this when running on a handheld only, as in they actually have no use of connecting this to an external monitor, even though there are benefits to doing so. Or rather, there are negatives with running only on a handheld, as we have to carry the finished frame back to the device to display on the handheld's display directly. So before we start getting into like the more meaty benchmarks, I wanted to quickly address what difference happens in terms of performance loss when we are running the same settings docked versus on a handheld, meaning what happens when we carry that finished frame back to the handheld's display? What type of performance loss can we expect? So let's take a look at those results. This series of benchmarks is only going to be taking a look at the performance degradation, if any, of actually finishing up that frame buffer and going straight out through HDMI to a monitor versus packaging up that frame buffer, sending it over the Thunderbolt, and then showing it off on the display of the handheld itself. So we can see what performance differences we get, if any. So we're going to go through all these pretty quickly. On Batman Arkham Knight, we're looking at, on averages, around 7% difference, and 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, effectively nothing really. So there's a small hit around 1% that we're getting, generally speaking, for this particular game, when versus docked, which is going to be better, or carrying back over to handheld, which does suffer a bit of a loss. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. This is Blackmyth Wukong, and again, we're just taking a look at the difference between docked versus going over the Thunderbolt cable. And we do actually see a bit of a bigger hit here. On averages, not so much, but on 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, we actually do see somewhere closer to like 5 and 8% of a performance hit that you're going to generally notice on handheld versus going straight docked. So a bit of a performance hit, but not tremendously so. This is Cyberpunk 2077. It's a Steam Deck preset at 1080p native. And here we actually see a pretty substantial loss going over that Thunderbolt cable. So on averages, we're about 20% hit. On 1 percentile, it's a 16% hit. And on 0.2 percentile, it's a 10% hit. So a pretty significant hit. And both of these are 5090 results, right? So all of these results have been from the 5090 itself, but this is going to be the same for the 5070 Ti. So generally speaking, this is the type of performance you're going to hit when you go over from Thunderbolt straight versus docked. So that's what Cyberpunk 2077 looks like. Let's continue to look at some more examples. And once again, quite similar to Cyberpunk 2077 is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. And if we take a look at the difference between docked and handheld settings, on averages, we're about a 10% hit. And then on 1 percentile, it's a 20% hit, and 0.2 percentile is a 25% hit. So pretty significant losses by going over that Thunderbolt cable. And for Doom the Dark Ages, once again, we got a pretty sizable hit. We're looking at a 50% difference on averages, 10% on 1 percentile, and 10% on 0.2 percentile. So again, a rather substantial hit in performance when we carry that back over to Thunderbolt using that Thunderbolt 5 cable, even though it's Thunderbolt 4. So we are seeing losses here when you're looking in a completely more portable type of play style. And the last game we're going to be looking at is Returnal. Obviously, all these have been 1080p results between docked and handheld because we're going to run 1080p on the handheld itself. And if we take a look, we're looking at 11% difference on averages, 9%, 10% difference on 1 percentile, and 16% difference on 0.2 percentile. So generally speaking, we're at around a 10% performance loss, sometimes next to nothing, and sometimes up to 20%. So it can vary, but generally speaking, it's not a free lunch. I want to make it clear to you that you will suffer some performance penalty by going back to the display and running on the handheld itself, as opposed to going directly out through the display output on the eGPU itself. So just be mindful of that happening. So since we know that, generally speaking, there is still a performance loss, let's start looking at what happens from a handheld only perspective on the 5070 Ti versus the 5090, and also on the Xbox Ally X running with nothing itself. So just running rendering on the Z2E of what this device is capable of, and then comparing all of them and seeing what is worthwhile here. One of the nice things about the ASUS ROG XG Mobile is it's so tiny. It is genuinely portable. So for people that were looking to take it with them anywhere they go and actually play on the device itself while the Thunderbolt is connected to it and charging the device, you can actually do that. So what does that look like between both models and running the Xbox Ally X by itself, just using the chipset itself on there, which is the Z2E. So the first game we're going to be taking a look at is Batman Arkham Knight, max settings at 1080p native. Now remember, the display is only 1080p, so going above that doesn't really pay any benefits. So we're going to be looking at just 1080p results. So on the Xbox Ally X at 25 watt TDP, which is pretty much its highest TDP, you're looking at around 68 FPS average and 52 on 1 percentile, which is really good. But if we take a look at what we get on the 5070 Ti and the 5090, take a look at the difference between the 5090 and the 5070. It's basically 5%. On 1 percentile, 2%, effectively nothing. So that's a huge price difference between the two. So if you're looking at it, if you are looking at it through the lens of, hey, I just actually want to play on the device itself and docked maybe here and there, but most of my use case is going to be back to the handheld itself, this is where the 5070 Ti makes a whole bunch of sense. So when we take a look at the comparison, we're looking at almost 2.5 times better on the 5070 Ti, and also a little bit over 2.5 times better on the 5090 Ti, the 5090. So that is the performance increase that you can expect by looking at these two eGPU solutions. Going to a more demanding game like Blackmyth Wukong, which is a pretty demanding Unreal Engine 5 game, here we can take a look at what the Xbox Ally X running on the Z2E by itself at 25 watt versus the 5070 Ti and the 5090 connected to it, running back through that Thunderbolt cable directly to the display itself at 1080p low settings native. At low settings 1080p native. With the Xbox Ally X, we're basically getting 30 FPS average, 26, so we're barely able to actually play this game at 1080p native at low settings for Blackmyth Wukong. If we take a look at the 5070 Ti, we're over 3 times better on the 5070 Ti and almost 4 times better on the 5090. So this is one area where we're taking a look at this and we're seeing, okay, there's a substantial difference, quite a bit of a difference between the 5090 and the 5070 Ti. So we're looking at 20% difference on averages, 21%, and 20% better on 1 percentile. So generally 20% better when coming back and running at 1080p for this generally demanding game on these two different eGPUs. And that's what it looks like between running on the device itself versus with these eGPUs that give it a significant uplift in performance and makes it far more playable and far more enjoyable. So that's what Blackmyth Wukong looks like. Let's take a look at Cyberpunk 2077. So like I said, Cyberpunk 2077, this is using the Steam Deck preset, so it doesn't have ray tracing enabled, and it's 1080p native. There is no upscaling here. There's no frame gen. It's basically just raw render. And if we take a look at the Xbox Ally X at 25 watt, we can see that we're basically barely able to run this at 1080p with the Steam Deck preset. It's going to be somewhat playable, but if we go ahead and connect to the 5070 Ti, we're looking at over 3 times better. And for the 5090, we're looking at 3.5 times better. So again, we still have a difference, but it's not gigantic between the 5070 Ti and the 5090. If we're taking a look here, we're only 12% better on averages and around 18% better on 1 percentile. So again, think about the price difference between these two platforms and what you're going to be getting and your use case. If you were thinking about mostly just playing on the device itself, I would argue that the 5070 Ti is the only thing that makes any sense whatsoever, and only using the 5090 if you had any aspirations of using a little bit more on the fancier Nvidia tech or trying to get closer to 4K output resolution for a docked experience. But this is what it looks like for Cyberpunk. Let's take a look at our next game. One game that I often like showing off is Deus Ex Mankind Divided because I use the DirectX 11 backend and there is no image reconstruction at all. So there is no upscaling. We're going to be doing 1080p native and leaning very hard on the Ultra preset. So this is going to be as demanding as we can possibly get on the GPU. And in fact, when we take a look at what the Xbox Ally X does at 25 watt, we can see once again, this is in the same realm as Cyberpunk, even though that's years older, as well as Blackmyth Wukong. And for all of these games, what we're looking at is basically generally barely playable with these particular settings. However, if we take a look at the 5070 Ti or the 5090, if we compare the Ally and handheld settings, we're almost 3.5 times better on the 5070 Ti and almost 4 times better on the 5090. But if we take a look at the difference between the 5070 Ti and the 5090, we're looking at 16% better on averages and 12% better on one percentile. So again, still in a realm of the 5090 is definitely doing better when we're bringing that Thunderbolt, bringing that frame buffer back to the handheld itself. And overall, we're not getting that much improvement between the two when, again, why would you go over 1080p when the device that we're going to be outputting to has a max resolution of 1080p? So again, be mindful of your use case and where you're going to be using this. This next game, obviously very demanding as well because it's Dim the Dark Ages, which has ray tracing running at all times. Now we are using the low settings here, but we are running 1080p native. And if you take a look at the Xbox Ally X, it's basically unplayable with these particular settings. So at 21, 22 FPS average, it's not something you want to do. You're going to have to run lower resolutions or use that new handheld preset settings. Low settings is actually significantly more challenging, and handheld drops a bunch more on top of that. But if we compare the Xbox Ally X, which is running the Z2E, and compare that to the 5070 Ti and the 5090, the 5070 Ti is almost 3 times better, and likewise the 5090 is as well. If we compare the 5070 Ti to the 5090, we can see that effectively there's not much of a difference at all. We're looking at 1% better on averages, 3% better on one percentile, effectively meaningless for these two eGPUs. So from this angle, it doesn't pay at all to get that 5090. All right, and the last game we're going to be taking a look at is Returnal. This is a very demanding GPU game. We're going to be using the Epic settings with no ray tracing, and we're using 1080p native. And if we take a look at these settings, you can see the Xbox Ally X with the Z2E is barely able to run this at all in these particular settings. However, if we take a look at the 5090 and the 5070 Ti, we can actually see that it's much better on the 5090 insofar as 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, but averages are effectively the same. Like we're a little bit better, but this is just margin of error anyway. So first, let's compare it to the Xbox Ally X with the Z2E at 25 watt, and we're looking at almost 4.5 times better on averages. And if we take a look at 1 percentile, it's almost 5 times better. So a gigantic increase in performance on the eGPU because, again, Returnal is such a demanding GPU game. However, if we take a look at the averages, I mean, it's effectively the same. We do have better 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. So we're 7% better on 1 percentile and 5% better on 0.2 percentile on the 5090 over the 5070 Ti. So we do effectively have a bit better performance on the 5090, but ultimately nothing. The only reason that you see the 5070 Ti on the top is because when I captured this, the average FPS was slightly higher, even though our 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile is actually better on the 5090. Overall, generally how you're going to look at this is it's probably closer to a wash, and especially with the price difference, it doesn't make much sense. Now, taking a look at those results, a few things should be clear. Number one is that there is a significant performance boost over the Z2E for the 5070 Ti and the 5090 eGPU solutions. So if you're the type of person that was looking for that capability of just plugging in a cable, it's powering the device, you don't have to worry about battery, and you're just going to get all that performance goodness directly on the device itself, you're going to see a performance improvement. Now, if you were taking a look at the difference between the 5070 Ti and the 5090, effectively in that scenario where you're basically running at a 1080p display, why would you go further? We only have a 1080p display here. There is no real purpose to get the 5090 versus the 5070 Ti. But let's say you don't just have that one consideration. You don't just have this one scenario where you only plan on running directly on the device, and you want to make use of the dock that is in the 2025 edition of the XG Mobile because it is a very competent dock. So you want to run docked at 4K or 1440p. Specifically for the 5090 and wanting to push it as hard as possible, like in Borderlands 4, you can do 4K maxed preset and use DLSS upscaling to hit mostly above 60 FPS frame rate without frame gen being up, which is pretty significant. Now, the 50 series of Nvidia does offer multi-frame gen, so we can go to 3 times and 4 times frame gen. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I think Cyberpunk typically has like the best frame gen type of implementation. It feels the best out of all of them. Sometimes it can be a bit of hit or miss. Like in Doom the Dark Ages, I don't really like using frame gen. It just feels a bit off. But again, in a game like Doom the Dark Ages running at 4K Ultra Nightmare settings, we can still generally hit above 60 FPS while using significant DLSS upscaling, but without frame gen. And the overall image quality is fantastic. And in many cases, that's kind of a repeating sample when modern games that are going to be pushing the envelope insofar as what is going to be possible. So we can push 4K max settings while using DLSS upscaling without frame gen. And there are also instances like in Indiana Jones where we can just do straight 4K native render on the 5090 version without upscaling or frame gen. And in slightly older games, still doing max settings and comfortably getting over 100 FPS. So now that we know that the 5090 can actually be used to greater effect, what happens when we take a look at comparing the 5070 Ti to the 5090 in 1440p and 4K resolutions? This is native without upscaling, so obviously upscaling is going to help us out a bunch. But to give you an idea of what the raw performance is between those two, does almost double the cost of the 5090 version make up the difference here when we start putting very strenuous GPU-bound scenarios at it? Let's take a look at those results. Since we've already taken a look at those 1080p results where we're really not stressing the GPU that much, and why would we? Because we're carrying that frame buffer over to the handheld and we have a max display of 1080p anyway. Let's see what happens when we take that frame buffer and go directly out to a monitor where we won't have that performance degradation, and see what happens and try to push on harder settings. So in this particular instance, let's look at Cyberpunk 2077. This is using the Ray Traced medium preset. It is at 1440p native with no upscaling. And really you can start to see that this is where the ceiling of the 5070 Ti eGPU is versus the 5090. And again, you could use upscaling. You can also use frame gen, which is going to be leaning on like the 2x, 3x, 4x frame gen if you really wanted to start pushing additional frames. And I've already shown you some examples of that as well. But when we take a look at here, this is where you're going to start seeing the difference between these two eGPUs. And we're looking at around 30% better on averages and on 1 percentile. So that's what it looks like at a 1440p native setting. Let's see what happens when we just try to do 4K native, which is tremendously hard. Now here are the 4K results using the Ray Tracing medium preset. Again, this is 4K native. There is no upscaling whatsoever. And as a result, we're seeing a pretty brutal frame rate. So at the 5070 Ti, we're at 16.7 FPS, and the 5090 is at 25. If we look at the difference, we're at a 50% difference on averages and 43% on the 1 percentile. So that shows you how stark of a difference, especially when we're going to much, much higher resolutions. However, you're still in a space where neither of these are really all that great in terms of having playable settings. But if you were looking at it through the lens of using the 5090 to also use upscaling, also use frame gen, also a little bit more relaxed settings, you're going to be able to appreciate a better docked experience overall. But again, this is taking a look at native settings, so you have a better idea of what to expect from these eGPUs and consider if it's worthwhile. Let's take a look at Doom the Dark Ages. So here we're taking a look at Doom the Dark Ages. This is with the Ultra Nightmare preset. Also, there is no path tracing. However, ray tracing is enabled. It's always enabled, in fact. So we do have ray tracing enabled here. Just path tracing, like full-on ray tracing, isn't there. And it is 1440p native. So there's no upscaling whatsoever, and we're actually rendering at that 1440p resolution. And for both of these, the 5070 Ti and the 5090, they're both playable, but you can see that we have a tighter spread on the 5090 and it's a little bit better. But if we take a look at averages, only 12% better on averages and 1% better on 1 percentile. So inside of this scope, the 5070 Ti and the 5090 are pretty neck and neck. Let's see what happens when we bump it up to 4K. Now here are the 4K results, and here we can see a stark difference between the two. Both of these are actually playable, although granted the 5090 is a far better experience. When we take a look at averages, before 80% better on averages and 25% better on 1 percentile, 35 FPS versus 48, 49 FPS on averages for both of these. If we take a look at 1 percentile, they're pretty close. We're a little bit under 30 FPS or 36 FPS, which is a bit more playable. Again, all of these are going to be a lot better when we start using upscaling, and you can also leverage frame gen as well. Although I don't really like frame gen in Doom the Dark Ages. Frame gen in Cyberpunk actually feels a lot better, but in Doom the Dark Ages it doesn't. So I would really just look at image reconstruction, general image upscaling with no frame gen on, specifically for Doom the Dark Ages, but that's just its own particular case. Let's take a look at another game where we're going to be pushing really hard settings, including ray tracing. And the last game that we'll be looking at to compare docked settings for 1440p and 4K, we're going to be taking a look at Returnal. This is the Epic preset with Epic Ray Tracing at 1440p native. And here we can see, because this is such a demanding GPU-driven game, that we also see those large differences between both of them. Now, both of these are still fantastic experiences. We're looking at 60 FPS average and 85 FPS average. Although the 5090, clearly, we're at 56.6 on our 1 percentile, so the overall feel is just going to be far better on the 5090 version. So this is where, again, if we take a look at this and think about pushing maximum graphical settings, it's going to be able to get you closer to a 4K output insofar as image quality while still having very good frame rate. So this is what it looks like. Both of these are pretty good experiences. And again, you can still use upscaling and frame gen on Returnal for DLSS. So those are both still totally worthwhile and still something that are completely suitable. But let's take a look at the 4K results. Now, here are the 4K results. What's pretty interesting is that the 5070 Ti is actually doing fairly well, considering this is 4K native, epic settings, and epic ray tracing. So this is the max settings that we can do while pushing 4K native. It's actually really impressive what we're actually able to achieve here, where you can almost get 30 FPS. Now, inside this scope, I would not actually put any frame gen because it wouldn't really feel all that great. And even for 4K here, but with upscaling to 4K is really where that 5090 is going to overall benefit. So we have 50 FPS on average and 34 FPS on 35 FPS average on the 5070 Ti. The difference between them is 43% on averages and 37% on 1 percentile. So again, to wrap this all up, generally speaking, we're looking at between 30 to 40% better on the 5090. However, it's in areas where we really have to stress the GPU in so far as render resolution, or games that are severely taxing on the GPU, as well as really taxing on ray tracing properties. So overall, both of them are still pretty good, but if you want ultimate performance, you really are going to be leveraging the 5090 overall. However, again, huge price increase between the two of them. So that's what it looks like from the docked settings. So hopefully, now that we've gone over 1440p and 4K results directly outputting from the eGPUs themselves on the 5070 Ti versus the 5090 at 1440p and 4K, generally we're around 40 to 50% better, like as a max. Now, 40 to 50% better is still significant, but with the 5090 being almost 100% more expensive, the math on that kind of doesn't really work out for most people, I would think. So really, if you wanted to start extracting those gains, I would really consider what you're trying to do here, and if your use case really matters all that much insofar as what the eGPU offers you insofar as portability and performance and price. There's just lots of ifs or considerations of if that's worth it or not. Now, there is one thing that ASUS provides in their Armory Crate software, that is overclocking the eGPUs. And I have results for those, and basically what it comes down to is in no real place does overclocking actually help in any regard. It just makes the device louder, and performance-wise, we don't get much. So I'm just going to briefly cover that here. And we can overclock the 5090 and the 5070 Ti, but generally speaking, in both instances, it really doesn't pay at all, and it just serves to make the device louder for really no reason whatsoever. I'm going to show you two different results. We're going to show you what the low end looks like, where we're going to be pushing for higher clocks on a low render target, so like 1080p. So in this case, we're looking at Blackmyth Wukong, low settings, 1080p native. This is still a challenging game to run. It's a challenging UE5 game to run. But if we take a look at the difference between overclocked and not overclocked, we're looking at a 3% difference on averages and 3% better on 1 percentile. So generally speaking, totally not really worthwhile to be overclocking this. Let's take a look at it from the other end, where we're going to be pushing higher resolutions and higher settings and see what happens. And on the flip side of the coin, where something that I thought would have made a benefit, but it generally doesn't, and it's pretty much the same thing regardless of which way we look at this. And this happens often, but it basically, I'm just going to try to say is that in no real world does overclocking this on the 5070 Ti or the 5090 actually make all that much of a difference. In this, we're looking at 3.6% better on averages and 2% better on 1 percentile. Effectively, the same difference between even running at lower resolutions versus higher resolutions. In no particular instance does overclocking really benefit or matter all that much outside of just making the device louder. So I just can't really recommend overclocking. In fact, I would offer that you should underclock a little bit and try to tune fans just so that it really becomes as inaudible as possible. So can I recommend the 2025 edition of the XG Mobile? Ultimately, I do miss the eGPUs. I actually really enjoyed having them around. I liked having the power. I liked having the portability. I liked everything about it because it offered a ton of versatility insofar as what I could get out of my device. If you wanted something that would offer a full docking solution while giving you significantly more GPU performance and having future proofing with Thunderbolt 5, there's a lot to love about what is on offer for the 2025 edition of the XG Mobile. It's really cool. Now, the 5090 version is something that I don't find myself that I would be buying it. I would only be looking at the 5070 Ti version because of the versatility of what it offers me, being able to play on the device, being docked. I still get like kind of a best of both worlds scenario while not spending $2,500 at $1,300. But even then, at the $1,300, I myself, being the type of person that I am with my house that I have, I would probably get more of a more complete desktop solution that would probably be about $1,300 and still getting either the same or better performance, but I don't have any of that versatility. But that's just where I am specifically. That's not to say that how you might want to use this device. Maybe you want the portability. Maybe you need something that has space considerations. Maybe you need to be a nomad, a digital nomad, and have the ability to go wherever you want. Or some use case where having something that you can plug into that'll be low power and boost the performance on your gaming handheld, that is a real thing that is super awesome. So I would really think that I would really advise you that if you're going to look at either one of them, mostly playing on the device, I would pretty much lean on the 5070 Ti version only. And the 5090 version is the most luxurious one. In either scenario, both of these are white glove treatment. They're rolling out the red carpet. This thing is exceedingly simple to use, and it offers everything to get you started without you even having to think. You literally plug it in. There's no power button that you need to hit on the XG Mobile itself. You see a little LED indicator when you plug it in, indicating it's on and ready to go. It offers Armory Crate, even if you're on an ASUS computer, to download and manage the XG Mobile itself, as well as drivers. It does pretty much everything for you. You just have to click yes or things that it offers you. It is as easy of an eGPU solution as you can possibly use. So from that angle, yes, I can recommend it, but it does have a high price with it. For some people, that price may be worth it. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time and thanks for watching.